Hello everybody. As we wrap up this semester, our final topic, which I've included in just 1 week's presentation this time, is addressing difficult topics. So we're going to go through the academic, social behavioral, abuse, neglect, bullying, and school crisis examples of difficult topics to engage in communication with different family members or students or children. So first, academic issues. Specifically, what we mean by academic issues is not performing as expected or at the appropriate developmental level, given the child's age or grade or and so on. And how that can affect the student is pretty broad and multifaceted, but a couple of really specific things are that developmental or academic achievement or milestones can ultimately, if they're not met, leave the child or the student lacking certain basic skills that they need to move on into the next level of or the next phase of life or of school. And so that's a kind of general impact overall, but more specifically, later in life, there is an increased risk of dropout and even poor work success with struggling academic or developmental issues earlier in life. So some ways that you might notice or some risk indicators that might point to there being academic issues. And when I say academic issues, academics for younger children basically points to social and emotional types of development, so developmental issues. So that's what they're learning in school primarily, so that's what their academics are, so to speak. But some ways that you might notice that these issues are happening, you might think of them, there being polarized ways of knowing, either defiance or over-compliance. Students or children, sometimes they rebel or go against the authority around them, and sometimes they over-comply with the authority around them. So if the example of that is if a student or a child is always trying to impress or always trying to keep their toe to the line with the rules, that doesn't necessarily mean there's academic issues. But sometimes students, when they realize that they're kind of lagging behind the other students, I think it's that they want to try to make up for it in some way. They want to achieve, and one way they can do that is by being very compliant. So ways to support the child and family really depends a lot on the environment. So there's a kind of shared sense of responsibility that comes into play between the teacher or child care worker and other members of staff at the facility, and of course the child themselves and their families. And the school climate reflecting that shared sense of responsibility is going to be really important too. When communicating with parents, it's really going to be important to make sure that they feel included and that there's a collaborative kind of environment to to any solutions that might be sought out. So with more specific social or behavioral types of issues, what we're talking about is a broad range of either internalized or externalized issues. So what we mean when we say internalized is that, examples of internalized issues might include things like anxiety. So you can't always tell that a person is feeling anxious, especially a child, when there's a lot going on up here in their thoughts. The inside, their inner experience of their body might be just totally racked with tension, but they might not express that. Externalized issues might be that they look and sound excessively nervous, but more specifically what that word externalized means is that it leads to behavioral types of issues: disrespect, physical aggression, not talking out of turn, things like that. What effects it could have on the student without help if the student has social or behavioral issues and they're not handled properly by the adults in their lives, it can lead to some pretty drastic things. They develop a kind of habit or pattern of this type of social or behavioral issue, and it could lead to poor outcomes in a lot of different ways. How they get along with others as they age, how they continue to achieve in school, even to the point of increasing dropout and substance use as well. Some things, areas that you might look to assess the risk is pretty broad. So you're, of course, dealing with the child individually. We also might pay attention to what the attitudes of family members from which the child comes, like what kind of home conversations are had that relate to problem behaviors at school. Like, how do the parents or caregivers talk about talking out of turn? How does the family address issues related to fighting or physical aggression, for instance? It can be pretty telling and informative. So with these types of behavioral issues, it's going to be really important, again, for the whole community or climate of the facility where the child is treated is of one front. So you can kind of create this atmosphere where these behavioral kinds of things are included as through demonstration of positive behaviors, but also through reinforced learning about consequences. But of course, dealing with children in smaller groups or at the individual level are going to come into play and be especially important when dealing with just day-to-day behavioral issues too. So there's kind of like a broad spectrum, the broadest of which is the school-wide kind of climate, all the way down to the individual dealings. There's lots of different levels of support that can be given for behavioral types of issues. When communicating with parents about behavior, it's really especially important to include or to gear the conversation toward person-first language. You don't want to give the impression or give the message that you're considering their child to be the bad kid. So there's the child first, and there's ultimate value and importance in that child. And there are these other things about them or decisions that they make about their behaviors or patterns of conduct, and those are the things that are the issues, not the child themselves. Making that clear to parents is a really good way to keep them on the same page with you and to convince them that you're on their side. Now, when we are looking for signs of abuse or neglect in the home, it's really important to be sensitive to red flags, because you, the professionals, are going to be very likely one of the first people to be able to do anything about it. So you're going to be considered mandated reporters. So anyone who works professionally in an environment where children or families broadly are treated or dealt with are considered mandated reporters. That means you can be liable for not reporting suspicions of neglect or abuse. And so what do we talk about what do we mean when we talk about neglect or abuse? Physical, emotional, sexual, or psychological maltreatment of children is specifically what abuse or neglect refers to. So mistreating a child, an underage individual, in any of those domains, physically harm them, emotionally harm them, sexually mistreat them, or psychologically harm them. And neglect is kind of like a specific instance of psychological abuse. Okay, so that's how that fits in there. Just instead of mistreating them, there's zero treatment. There's inattention, which is a form of mistreatment. The ways that this type of treatment affects the students is very profound. There's a drop in the likelihood of all kinds of thriving. It's a drop in the likelihood that the child will developmentally thrive, and certainly will have an impact on how they deal with other students or other adults, and the ways that they think about themselves, the ways that they interact with their own emotions will be very profoundly impacted by abuse or neglect. So I mentioned mandated reporting. when you find yourself in a position where you're the mandated reporter, it's important to keep in mind that there are specific things that you can kind of keep an eye out for. There's a really great table 5.4 in the book for physical or behavioral signs of abuse or neglect. And seeing these things does not mean automatically there's abuse or neglect happening. Those are signs of suspicion. So what you're reporting, if you're a mandated reporter and you make a report, you're reporting a suspicion of abuse or neglect. You do not have to have proof. You don't have to be absolutely certain. Your job, it's a little like this, you're just at the screening process. You're just kind of giving a survey of the land and making mention to others who dive into investigation more thoroughly, giving them an idea that there might be some sign of threat happening. There does have to be, however, you do have to have a first-person perspective of it. That means if you're the one making the report, you have to be the one seeing the suspicion. Whatever the red flag was, you have to be the one who observes it. If someone else comes to you and says, hey, I saw this red flag about this child that I deal with, can you make a report for me? You'll have to let them know that they would be the ones to do that. So how to support children who might be experiencing abuse or neglect? It can't be overstated how important your relationship with them is. The child is already going to have a damaged kind of trust in possibly other adult or peer figures in their lives. So you will have to have been building a relationship with them from day one for them to be comfortable with you enough to talk with you about it or just to be with you as they face these things. And it's important to remember that any mistreatment of a child will very possibly have an impact in how they see themselves. It's very common for a person who's been abused or neglected to feel as though they deserve it for some reason, for instance. And that's a very sticky thing for a person to grow up in. So that's something to keep in mind as you help them with it. When communicating with parents, if you're making a report about the parents or someone in the home, you should not contact them. You should never contact them to tell them you're going to make a report. You definitely don't have to talk with them about the report you made. You'll be talking with the appropriate reporting organization, and they'll get the information they need from you, and the parent